All Creatures Great and Small, Chapter 58. It looked as though I was going to make it back to the road all right, and I was thankful for it, because 7 o'clock in the morning, with the wintry dawn only just beginning to lighten the eastern rim of the moor, was no time to be digging my car out of the snow. This narrow, unfenced road skirted a high tableland and gave on to a few lonely farms at the end of even narrower tracks. It hadn't actually been snowing on my way out to this early call, a uterine hemorrhage in a cow, but the wind had been rising steadily and whipping the top surface from the white blanket which had covered the fell tops for weeks. My headlights had picked out the creeping drifts, pretty, pointed fingers feeling their way inch by inch across the strip of tarmac. This was how all blocked roads began. And at the farm, as I injected pituitrin and packed the bleeding cervix with a clean sheet, I could hear the wind buffeting the byre door and wondered if I would win the race home. On the way back, the drifts had stopped being pretty and lay across the road like white bolsters, but my little car had managed to cleave through them, veering crazily at times, wheels spinning, and now I could see the main road a few hundred yards ahead, reassuringly black in the pale light. But just over there on the left, a field away, was Coat House. I was treating a bullock there. He'd eaten some frozen turnips, and a visit was fixed for today. I didn't fancy trailing back up here if I could avoid it, and there was a light in the kitchen window. The family were up anyway. I turned and drove down into the yard. The farmhouse door lay within a small porch, and the wind had driven the snow inside, forming a smooth 2-foot heap against the timbers. As I leaned across to knock, the surface of the heap trembled a little, then began to heave. There was something in there, something quite big. It was eerie standing in the half-light, watching the snow parting to reveal a furry body. Some creature of the wild must have strayed in, searching for warmth. But it was bigger than a fox or anything else I could think of. Just then the door opened and the light from the kitchen streamed out. Peter Trenholm beckoned me inside, and his wife smiled at me from the bright interior. They were a cheerful young couple. "What's that?" I gasped, pointing at the animal which was shaking the snow vigorously from its coat. "That?" Peter grinned. "That's old Tip." "Tip, your dog? But what's he doing under a pile of snow?" "Just blew in on him, I reckon. That's where he sleeps, just outside back door." I stared at the farmer. "You mean he sleeps there out in the open every night?" "Aye, always, summer and winter. But don't look at me like that, Mr. Harriet. It's his own choice. The other dogs have a warm bed in the cow house, but Tip won't entertain it. He's 15 now, and he's been sleeping out there since he was a pup. I remember when my father was alive, he tried all ways to get the old fella to sleep inside, but it was no good." I looked at the old dog in amazement. I could see him more clearly now. He wasn't the typical sheepdog type. He was bigger boned, longer in the hair, and he projected a bursting vitality that didn't go with his 15 years. It was difficult to believe that any animal living in these bleak uplands should choose to sleep outside and thrive on it. I had to look closely to see any sign of his great age. There was the slight stiffness in his gait as he moved around, perhaps a fleshless look about his head and face, and of course the telltale lens opacity in the depths of his eyes. But the general impression was of an unquenchable jauntiness. He shook the last of the snow from his coat, pranced jerkily up to the farmer and gave a couple of reedy barks. Peter Trenholm laughed. You see, he's ready to be off. He's a beggar for work as Tip. He led the way towards the buildings, and I followed, stumbling over the frozen ruts like iron under the snow and bending my head against the knife-like wind. It was a relief to open the byre door and escape into the sweet bovine warmth. There was a fair mixture of animals in the long building. The dairy cows took up most of the length. Then there was a few young heifers, some bullocks, and finally, in an empty stall deeply bedded with straw, the other farm dogs. The cats were there too, so it had to be warm. No animal is a better judge of comfort than a cat, and they were just visible as furry balls in the straw. They had the best place, up against the wooden partition, where the warmth came through from the big animals. Tip strode confidently among his colleagues, a young dog and a bitch with 3 half-grown pups. You could see he was boss. One of the bullocks was my patient, and he was looking a bit better. When I'd seen him yesterday, his rumen, the big first stomach, had been completely static and atonic following an overeager consumption of frozen turnips. He'd been slightly bloated and groaning with discomfort, but today, as I leaned with my ear against his left side, I could hear the beginnings of the surge and rumble of the normal rumen instead of the deathly silence of yesterday. My gastric lavage had undoubtedly tickled things up, and I felt that another of the same would just about put him right. Almost lovingly, I got together the ingredients of one of my favorite treatments, long since washed away in the flood of progress. The ounce of formalin, the half-pound of common salt, the can of black treacle from the barrel, which you used to find in most cowhouses, all mixed up in a bucket with 2 gallons of hot water. I jammed the wooden gag into the bullock's mouth and buckled it behind the horns. Then, as Peter held the handles, I passed the stomach tube down into the rumen and pumped in the mixture. When I finished, the bullock opened his eyes wide in surprise and began to paddle his hind legs. Listening again at his side, I could hear the reassuring bubbling of the stomach contents. I smiled to myself in satisfaction. It worked. It always worked. Wiping down the tube, I could hear the hiss as Peter's brother got on with the morning's milking. And as I prepared to leave, he came down the byre with a full bucket on the way to the cooler. As he passed the dog's stall, he tipped a few pints of the warm milk into their dishes, and Tip strolled forward casually for his breakfast. While he was drinking, the young dog tried to push his way in, but a soundless snap from Tip's jaws missed his nose by a fraction, and he retired to another dish. I noticed, however, that the old dog made no protest as the bitch and pups joined him. The cats, black and white, tortoiseshell, tabby gray, appeared, stretching from the straw, and advanced in a watchful ring. Their turn would come. Miss Trenholm called me in for a cup of tea, and when I came out, it was full daylight, but the sky was a burdened gray, and the sparse tree near the house strained their bare branches against the wind, which drove in long, icy gusts over the white, empty miles of moor. It was what the Yorkshiremen called a thin wind, or sometimes a lazy wind, the kind that couldn't be bothered to blow round you, but went straight through instead. It made me feel that the best place on earth was by the side of that bright fire in the farmhouse kitchen. Most people would have felt that, but not old Tip. He was capering around as Peter loaded a flat cart with some hay bales for the young cattle in the outside barns. And as Peter shook the reins and the cob set off over the fields, he leapt on to the back of the cart. As I threw my tackle into the boot, I looked back at the old dog, legs braced against the uneven motion, tail waving, barking defiance at the cold world. I carried away the memory of Tip, who scorned the softer things and slept in what he considered the place of honor at his master's door. A little incident like this has always been able to brighten my day, and fortunately, I have the kind of job where things of this kind happened. And sometimes it isn't even a happening, just a single luminous phrase. As when I was examining a cow one morning while its neighbor was being milked. The milker was an old man and he was having trouble. He was sitting well into the cow, his cloth-capped head buried in her flank, the bucket gripped tightly between his knees. But the stool kept rocking about as the cow fidgeted and weaved. Twice she kicked the bucket over, and she had an additional little trick of anointing her tail with particularly liquid feces, then lashing the old man across the face with it. Finally, he could stand it no longer. Leaping to his feet, he dealt a puny blow at the cow's craggy back and emitted an exasperated shout. "Stand still, thou shittin' old Bovril!" Or the day when I had to visit Luke Benson at his small holding in Hillam Village. Luke was a powerful man of about 60 and had the unusual characteristic of speaking always through his clenched teeth. He literally articulated every word by moving only his lips, showing the rows of square, horse-like incisors clamped tightly together. It lent a peculiar intensity to his simplest utterance, and as he spoke, his eyes glared. Most of his conversation consisted of scathing remarks about the other inhabitants of Hillam. In fact, he seemed to harbor a cordial dislike of the human race in general. Yet, strangely enough, I found him a very reasonable man to deal with. He accepted my diagnosis of his animal's ailments without question and appeared to be trying to be friendly by addressing me repeatedly as Gems, which was the nearest he could get to my name with his teeth together. His fiercest hatred was reserved for his neighbor and fellow smallholder, a little lame man called Gil, to whom Luke referred invariably and unkindly as "yon oppen youth." A bitter feud had raged between them for many years, and I had seen Luke smile on only 2 occasions. Once when Mr. Gill's sow lost its litter, and again when he had a stack burnt down. When Mr. Gill's wife ran away with a man who came round the farm selling brushes, it caused a sensation. Nothing like that had ever happened in Hillam before, and a wave of delighted horror swept through the village. This, I thought, would be the high point of Luke Benson's life, and when I had to visit a heifer of his, I expected to find him jubilant. But Luke was gloomy. As I examined and treated his animal, he remained silent, and it wasn't until I went into the kitchen to wash my hands that he spoke. He glanced round warily at his wife, a gaunt, grim-faced woman who was applying blacklead to the grate. "You'll have heard about yon oppen youth's missus running off," he said. "Yes," I replied. "I did hear about it." I waited for Luke to gloat, but he seemed strangely ill at ease. He fidgeted until I had finished drying my hands, then he glared at me and bared his strong teeth. I'll tell you something, Gems, he ground out. I wish somebody would take that, my bugger. And there was that letter from the Bromleys that really made me feel good. You don't find people like the Bramleys now. Radio, television, and the motor car have carried the outside world into the most isolated places so that the simple people you used to meet on the lonely farms are rapidly becoming like people anywhere else. There are still a few left, of course, old folk who cling to the ways of their fathers. And when I come across any of them, I like to make some excuse to sit down and talk with them and listen to the old Yorkshire words and expressions, which have almost disappeared. But even in the 30s, when there were many places still untouched by the flood of progress, the Bramleys were in some ways unique. There were 4 of them, 3 brothers, all middle-aged bachelors, and an older sister, also unmarried, and their farm lay in a wide, shallow depression in the hills. You could just see the ancient tiles of Scar House through the top branches of the sheltering trees if you stood outside the pub in Drewburn Village. And in the summer, it was possible to drive down over the fields to the farm. I had done it a few times, the bottles in the boot jingling and crashing as the car bounced over the rig and furrow. The other approach to the place was right on the other side through Mr. Broom's stackyard, and then along a track with ruts so deep that only a tractor could negotiate it. There was, in fact, no road to the farm, but that didn't bother the Bromleys because the outside world held no great attraction for them. Miss Bramley made occasional trips to Derby on market days for provisions, and Herbert, the middle brother, had come into town in the spring of 1929 to have a tooth out, but apart from that, they stayed contentedly at home. A call to Scar House always came as rather a jolt, because it meant that at least 2 hours had to be removed from the working day. In all but the driest weather, it was safer to leave the car at Mr. Broom's and make the journey on foot. One February night at about 8 o'clock, I was splashing my way along the track, feeling the mud sucking at my Wellingtons. It was to see a horse with colic, and my pockets were stuffed with the things I might need. A Recaline, vials of morphia, a bottle of paraproxia. My eyes were half closed against the steady drizzle, but about half a mile ahead I could see the lights of the house winking among the trees. After 20 minutes of slithering in and out of the unseen puddles and opening a series of broken string-tied gates, I reached the farmyard and crossed over to the back door. I was about to knock when I stopped with my hand poised. I found I was looking through the kitchen window, and in the interior, dimly lit by an oil lamp, the Bramleys were sitting in a row. They weren't grouped round the fire, but were jammed tightly on a long, high-backed wooden settle, which stood against the far wall. The strange thing was the almost exact similarity of their attitudes. All 4 had their arms folded, chins resting on their chests, feet stretched out in front of them. The men had removed their heavy boots and were stocking-footed, but Miss Bramley wore an old pair of carpet slippers. I stared, fascinated by the curious immobility of the group. They were not asleep, not talking or reading or listening to the radio. In fact, they didn't have one. They were just sitting. I had never seen people just sitting before, and I stood there for some minutes to see if they would make a move or do anything at all, but nothing happened. It occurred to me that this was probably a typical evening. They worked hard all day, had their meal, then they just sat till bedtime. A month or two later, I discovered another unsuspected side of the Bramleys when they started having trouble with their cats. I knew they were fond of cats by the number and variety which swarmed over the place and perched confidently on my car bonnet on cold days with their unerring instinct for a warm place. But I was unprepared for the family's utter desolation when the cats started to die. Miss Bramley was on the doorstep at Skeldale House nearly every day carrying an egg basket with another pitiful patient, a cat or sometimes a few tiny kittens, hutting miserably inside. Even today, with the full range of modern antibiotics, the treatment of feline enteritis is unrewarding, and I had little success with my salicylates and nonspecific injections. I did my best. I even took some of the cats in and kept them at the surgery so that I could attend them several times a day, but the mortality rate was high. The Bramleys were stricken as they saw their cats diminishing. I was surprised at their grief because most farmers took on cats as pest killers and nothing more. But when Miss Bramley came in one morning with a fresh consignment of invalids, she was in a sorry state. She stared at me across the surgery table, and her rough fingers clasped and unclasped on the handle of the egg basket. "Is it going to go through them all?" she quavered. "Well, it's very infectious, and it looks as though most of your young cats will get it anyway." For a moment, Miss Bramley seemed to be struggling with herself. Then her chin began to jerk, and her whole face twitched uncontrollably. She didn't actually break down, but her eyes brimmed, and a couple of tears wandered among the network of wrinkles on her cheeks. I looked at her helplessly as she stood there, wisps of gray hair straggling untidily from under the incongruous black beret which she wore pulled tightly over her ears. "It's Topsy's kittens I'm worried about," she gasped out at length. "There's 5 of them, and they're the best we've got." I rubbed my chin. I had heard a lot about Topsy, one of strain of incomparable ratters and mousers. Her last family were only about 10 weeks old, and it would be a crushing blow to the Bramleys if anything happened to them. But what the devil could I do? There was, as yet, no protective vaccine against the disease. Or wait a minute, was there? I remembered that I'd heard a rumor that Burroughs Wellcome were working on one. I pulled out a chair. "Just sit down a few minutes, Miss Bramley. I'm going to make a phone call." I was soon through to the Wellcome laboratory and half expected a sarcastic reply, but they were kind and cooperative. They'd had encouraging results with the new vaccine and would be glad to let me have 5 doses if I would inform them of the result. I hurried back to Miss Bramley. "I've ordered something for your kittens. I can't guarantee anything, but there's nothing else to do. Have them down here on Tuesday morning." The vaccine arrived promptly, and as I injected the tiny creatures, Miss Bramley extolled the virtues of the Topsy line. "Look at the size of them ears. Did you ever see bigger ones on kittens?" I had to admit that I hadn't. The ears were enormous, sail-like, and they made the ravishingly pretty little faces look even smaller. Miss Bramley nodded and smiled with satisfaction. "Aye, you can always tell. It's the sure sign of a good mouser." The injection was repeated a week later. The kittens were still looking well. "Well, that's it," I said. "We'll just have to wait now. But remember, I want to know the outcome of this, so please don't forget to let me know." I didn't hear from the Bramleys for several months and had almost forgotten about the little experiment when I came upon a grubby envelope which had apparently been pushed under the surgery door. It was the promised report and was, in its way, a model of conciseness. It communicated all the information I required without frills or verbiage. It was in a careful, spidery scrawl and said simply, "Dear sir, them kittens is now big cats. Yours truly, R. Bramley."